Welcome to Authors Revealed. I'm Becky Anderson. We are thrilled to have Holly Tucker here and her new work of nonfiction. It's called City of Light, City of Poison, Murder, Magic, and the First Police Chief of Paris. This is one of those nonfiction pieces that reads more incredibly than any fiction you can imagine. Holly, welcome back to Anderson's in Naperville. It is so incredible to have you back with your new book.
Thank you. It's such a treat. This is our hometown bookstore. So to be able to speak to people here and to bring all of my family, friends in the community, thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, this is a pleasure. And you know what, this book, when I first saw it on Norton's list, you know, looking through the new books for this season, I thought, oh my gosh, this title is just, it caught me immediately. So City of Light, City of Poison, and about the first police chief of Paris. I mean, what an incredible story. And everything I've read about this book and reading the book, I cannot believe that this is nonfiction. It reads better than some fiction by far.
Oh, wow.
No, I'm serious. I'm totally serious. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, how can you go wrong? There are witches, there's poison, there are murders, tortures. It's,
right.
Yeah, you can't make this stuff up, actually.
Right. Yeah. So the book's been out almost a month, right? And this is your third book that you've published,
That's right?
So what are you hearing from some of your readers who loved your previous book, which you were here for about, you said 6 years ago. I can't believe it's been 6 years.
Me neither. I have to write faster. I need to get these.
Well, I can imagine what kind of research, and we'll talk about that a bit later. So what are you hearing though from readers and from reviewers and everything? Because I know you've gotten some great reviews on this title, especially.
I think the ones that matter most to me are the ones from readers themselves and people who get a hold of me through my website and send a note and say that they were up late reading it.
Yay,
that just makes me so happy.
So where, you know, I know what, in a researcher, and I know you're a professor and you teach at Vanderbilt, but knowing where the research starts and where do you find a story where it grabs you? And this is one of those stories, you know, about the poisons and everything that were happening, the poisonings in Paris in the aristocracy at the later part of the 17th century. But where did you come across this story, and especially about this man? And you're going to kill me on the pronunciation, but Nicolas de la Reynie?
De la Reynie, that's pretty good.
Oh, see, I'm not French.
You know, you can call him Nick. That's how I would call him Nick. We'll call him Nick.
Yeah. But where did you come across this story? Because there's the other part of the story that's known throughout history and that people have heard of, but about his story,
right?
And what Louis did, Louis XIV,
right,
made him sort of the police chief of Paris. So where did you come across this, and what grabbed you about this story that made you want to write about it?
I teach a lot about Versailles in my classes at Vanderbilt, and what we know about the Sun King and the splendor of his palaces and this big history. I'm too much of a skeptic to think that it was all pomp and glory, and forever I've wanted to get to the underbelly of what was happening in France at that time. And so this is a story I've known about for a very long time, and I thought I would write it before I wrote Bloodwork. But the problem was I despaired because I learned that so La Reynie, the police chief, was digging through, trying to figure out where these murders by poison were coming from. And the deeper he went into his investigations, the more he found out that Louis XIV's court members were involved. Right. And the problem was Louis XIV, toward the end, I begin the book with this, decided at the very end that these documents were way too scandalous and way too troubling for them to be out in public and actually to be out in history. So at the day after the police chief dies, Louis XIV, on a hot July day, takes the documents and starts feeding them into the fireplace at Versailles. So how do you write a book when your
Right.
main documents, right, are missing? And so that's why I said, well, forget this. I'll write Blood Work, because that's another true crime about the first blood transfusions, and also dealing with poison. And it was really only when I started to dig through the archives, I just couldn't get it out of my mind. So each time I was in Paris, I'd pull the archives, go to the specialized library, and then I discovered that La Reynie actually kept careful notes of the most scandalous documents, inventoried them, and also gave his personal assessment about what was going on. So he had this 900-page manuscript page journal.
Wow.
And so I could write this book.
Yeah.
So it was a long odyssey. I think I've been thinking about this book for over 15 years,
Yeah.
Becky.
Wow. Wow. And what a story it is. So tell us about him. Tell us about Nick. We'll call him Nick. But tell, you said he was a little rough, you know,
Right.
but where did he come from? What was his background? And how did he come to the attention of Louis XIV?
Actually, I have a lot of admiration for him. He came to the attention of Louis XIV because he was working for Colbert, the Minister of the Interior in France. And he was out in Burgundy sending these reports. Colbert loved, they call him the information master. Colbert loved these reports, and they were meticulous reports that he demanded from people out in the provinces. And La Reynie was more than meticulous. He was diligent and was going above and beyond. And as Colbert was trying to think about who he might recommend to the king to become the very first police chief of Paris, Paris was in a state of disaster, he thought about La Reynie. And it turns out the more he investigated La Reynie, La Reynie was completely faithful to the king, and also very faithful to him during the first civil war that predates his individual reign. And that was the way Louis XIV decided who he liked. Is where were you during the Civil War? Were you on my side or somebody else's side? And he ends up really getting into this job and wanting to do a good job for the Parisians, right?
Yeah,
He's a good, honest guy. And so watching him struggle with the ethics of what you do when you see that there's a lot of evil stuff going on in the city for which you're responsible, and that could actually be endangering the king, there are these moments in the story where you get the feeling he's really struggling with just how far he's willing to go.
Right, right. And you know, you talk about Paris and Paris was a mess, you know. We all think of Paris now and, you know, the city of light, and it's you know, what a beautiful place that everyone loves to go to. But Paris of the late 1600s, the late, you know, 17th century was a disaster. I mean, it was.
I've had people ask me if I could go back in time and spend a day in 17th century Paris. Would I? Absolutely not. Absolutely not, because the streets were full of mud, muck. People would throw chamber pots out into the streets. On butcher days, the slaughterhouses, they didn't care. They would throw all of the stuff into the streets. Some of the streets in certain neighborhoods were stained red, if you can believe it. It's dark. There are no lights or lamps at night. And so he's dealing with this vicious, dangerous, dirty city. And Louis XIV has to address it, because if he wants to become this king of Europe, right? And he's building Versailles, you can't have your very own capital being a place where nobody ever wants to step foot.
Yeah. So Louis XIV was pretty embarrassed by what Paris had become at this point, and that's why he needed to clean it up, literally, or have. Yeah, this is just a crazy world that's going on, and things are. It's dangerous. You know, I mean, and I think you talk about, well, the guns that were available at the time, you know, and guns could be smaller now, so things could be more concealed and stuff like that. But with Nick, I know I'm going to mess up on, but he was appointed, and he was called the Lieutenant General of Police.
Right.
But his predecessors, there's an interesting story about two of his predecessors. One was the criminal lieutenant.
Right.
And tell us a little bit about that, because there's some intrigue there on what happened to two of them.
Within a matter of months, the civil lieutenant and the criminal lieutenant died. One, the criminal lieutenant, actually was murdered in broad daylight in his very own home. right? That doesn't bode well for your city's
Yeah.
reputation.
Yeah. Right.
And then about 8 months later, this civil lieutenant dies under really suspicious circumstances. No one quite realizes at that moment, but we'll find out later that he was poisoned. So essentially there's this vacuum of leadership in France, in Paris.
Yeah.
And there were no policemen. See, these two guys were more at the court level. They really weren't going in and doing the policing.
Right.
The policing was done by commissioners in each of the quarters, and the point there is they're not really getting out there trying to prevent crime. They're lawyers. They want to report crime and make money out of it. So there's no preemptive type of security or safety. La Reynie was the very first person to do that.
So the research on this book, and I always wondered, and someone who's a scholar, is it hard to stop? I mean, is it you go down the rabbit hole, and you know you got to say to yourself, okay, I've got enough. I have to stop because I have to start writing this book. But is it hard to stop because you just found one more thing and one more thing that is just so incredibly fascinating, especially when you're dealing with primary documents and stuff like that.
Well, I think there are plenty of shiny objects. You
Yeah,
can
right.
always
Sure,
go and
sure.
and particularly in the way that I try to write this, I really want to be able to get the smells, the feel, the noises, and so I can find any number of different books and accounts that will get me there. I think the hardest thing for me is just the sheer amount of primary documents.
Right.
These are manuscripts that are about this big by that big, and I was working with close to 30 bound volumes of these things.
Oh, wow.
All in different handwriting. Some of them were done by notaries, some scribes, police people, locals, the police chief himself. And so that was, and they're also, each account is different, right?
Yeah,
They're talking
right.
about the same thing, and then they come at it from a slightly different angle and trying to figure out who's telling the truth and who's not telling the truth.
Right.
That was the hardest bit for me.
Yeah, oh, I bet. And French was different at that time than it is today. So I'm sure you studied a lot of French from the 17th century
Right.
compared to modern French. So, but reading it, and it's so right, when everyone's handwriting, it can be so difficult to
And the
read.
spelling's not consistent either. Here's a
Okay.
little tidbit.
Okay, that's interesting,
You know,
too. Yeah.
people who may be watching this who've studied French, one of the most annoying things is accents. Trying to figure out where you're going to put an accent and what the accent needs to look like. And do you know why they had those accents? It's not necessarily to help you pronounce them. Those are leftover traces of 16th and 17th century spelling.
Oh,
Isn't that
interesting.
interesting?
Oh my gosh, I didn't know
so,
that.
So you
That's
have
great,
all
yeah.
weird spellings, and the reason why they put the accents there is because when the typographers were putting in the letters, right, to be able to do printing press stuff, it was a heck of a lot easier to reduce the letters down. So this is like
Oh,
shorthand.
okay, sure. Yeah.
So that you could say something's missing here.
So some remnants of that remain in modern day French. then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can see 17th century French all over
Oh,
in
that's
modern day
so
French.
interesting. So these documents that you read that were his, that that Louis hadn't destroyed or thrown into the fire, did it change some of your assumptions about Louis XIV? And reading these documents, because some of it's a bit salacious, and is
Right.
because he had multiple mistresses.
Right.
But what did it change anything, your preconceived notions about this time or any of those people who lived there?
Absolutely. I had a tendency to look at Louis XIV as something of a cad. He was out sleeping around with just about anybody he could find, and he had, maybe 4 or 5 really prominent mistresses, but I didn't realize the extent to which he actually was quite attached to these women. He may have, at different moments cast one off in favor of another, but especially the women who were implicated in the affair of the poisons, I really do think that he had a real dilemma about, can I believe some of the things they've been up to? And if I do, what do I do about it? He never really ever lost sight of any of his mistresses. Now, he may have sent 1 or 2 to a convent, but you could tell he was still watching to see what they were up to. So he ended up being both a more unlikable character to me, and also a more likable character than I never imagined.
You talk about the neighborhood where a lot of this stuff was going on, or the quarter. I don't know but tell us the name of this area in
It
Paris
was
at the time.
impossible to pronounce. It's Montorgueil.
Oh,
Montorgueil.
Montorgueil.
That's not bad.
Okay, well, I don't know if I'll remember that, but it was an incredible place where if you wanted to go and get something that was for cosmetics to make
Right.
your skin whiter, or you wanted a love potion, or you wanted something to put a curse on somebody, or you wanted poison or something. What an interesting place. Now, see,
Everything-
that's something that I would like to be a fly on the wall in that place.
Do you
just
know,
to see.
I spent years, I think the first time I was in that neighborhood, which is just 10 minutes from the Louvre.
Wow. Okay.
The first time I discovered that neighborhood was about 20 years ago. I was researching my first book, and I didn't realize that I was actually, the apartment that I typically rent is actually on what is now called the Leopold Ballon Street, and at the time it was called the street at the end of the world.
Oh, interesting.
Because
Yeah.
it's just now it's completely gentrified. It's a lovely, lovely neighborhood, but it's where the major crime dens were. It's where some of the most horrific poisonings took place, as well as one of my poisoners was also a very active abortionist and did her abortions in the back courtyard. Anything you wanted to buy was for sale. And it's also worth pointing out is the red light district still now is just 2 streets over from there. So everything is for sale there.
Yeah, right. But what a place though. And I love your discussion of witchcraft and how midwives sort of evolved into providing a lot more services than
Right.
just delivering a baby but a lot of
Right.
other services that weren't above board,
Right,
and it's
right.
out. But I thought it was so interesting because this time period sort of coincides with what was happening here in the colonies with Salem and the accusations of certain women and everything. So I thought that was really interesting. But being able to buy a curse or a poison or whatever, and knowing that women from the upper echelons of society could go there and
Right.
then use them. Because I think the discussion of what their life was like, whether you were at the top or you were at the bottom of society. So tell us a little bit about that, because that was really interesting. And women's relationship with men and feeling that the only way they could escape it was to use
I'm so
this
glad
idea.
you asked that question because so much of this is so scandalous and exciting
yeah,
and sort of
yeah.
CSI-ish, right? But at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, why are there so many women in this book? Why are there so many women doing the types of things that they are doing for so many other women? A lot of it is, what do you do when a marriage is arranged? Marriages are arranged. You're in a marriage you don't want to be in, right? But you also have found somebody else that you love, right? What is your only option? Divorce is not an option.
Right.
So the best that you can think about doing is maybe finding a way to get rid of your husband. Let's think about abortions as well. There's no birth control at this time. One, because the technologies, if you will, aren't necessarily there, but also it's something that would be completely frowned upon by the church. But what happens if you find yourself pregnant and not wanting to be? So, as well as with the midwives, the herbalists, the poison makers, the abortionists, how do you make a living if you are already in the very bottom of
Right.
society? You have to reach towards crime. So I would say that a lot of what this book brings out subtly is really the miserable condition for early modern women and the choices women have to be able to make to survive in this society.
And there was no escape if you had an abusive husband or were in a situation where you couldn't escape, but it was basically your life was at risk in some ways.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So tell us a little bit about some of the women from maybe Louis' court who might have come to this neighborhood to purchase.
Well, I
something.
try in this book to make it so that it's not really clear which of Louis' many women were actually involved in what. We do know that at least 2, if not 3, of the major mistresses in Louis XIV's life had connections to the midwives. There's one midwife in particular who's really a character and quite evil, in having their palms read, hoping to get love potions to keep Louis XIV either still in love with them or to draw his attention. And then also possibly casting spells or having spells cast on their behalf in places like Notre Dame, for crying out loud. I am never going to be able to go into Notre Dame and not think about that is a place where people were, that was one of the major marketplaces for poison. In Notre Dame. There are a few that I just love. There's Louise La Vallière, who was Louis XIV's first, what they call mistress in title, and she is a young virginal woman. All of the court made fun of her because she had a flat chest and would wear floppy bows to sort of give the illusion that she was more buxom than she really was. And she was eventually replaced by a complete opposite woman, Madame de Montespan, a married woman who was witty and really ambitious. And that was Louis XIV's most, I would say, his most important love. It was full of passion, it was full of fighting, it was full of drama. And each time, Madame de Montespan was quite smart, because each time she was pregnant, she knew that she would be out of commission for the king, and she would hand select basically her surrogates for the king. And then, of course, until he falls in love with one of them.
Right, exactly. So I think one of the midwives you were talking about, Catherine, and I won't pronounce this right,
Voisin.
Okay. And she was sort of like the gatekeeper or something.
Oh, she was.
So tell us about her. Interesting woman.
She has this drama about her. She wears these colorful cloaks and would open the door of her home in this impoverished neighborhood and sort of look potential clients up and down and ask how they got her name to see if she was interested in selling her services, and then women would say, I'm in trouble, I need some help. And she'd say, don't talk to me, go to the church. You go talk to the priest. And the more Catherine would refuse to help, the more the price of her services would increase. It was really neat going through the archives, Becky, because they confiscated all of her documents and all of her belongings. And we have letters that were written to this woman saying, I really want to get out of this marriage. Would you please help me poison my husband, and I will give you a bonus if you can do it quickly for me. So we have all these amazing documents from her home.
Wow. And it's so wonderful they still exist.
It's crazy. Yeah. And some of them have, this is where it gets a little, I came across a couple of pieces of manuscript that had burned holes in them. And how they would keep the poisons, the powdered poisons, is they'd take a piece of paper and they'd fold it into a little envelope. And there were moments where I was like,
what am I touching?
I don't know what this is.
Oh, jeez. But, this whole 5-year period, and they call it the Fair of the Poisons, this whole 5-year period, it's just incredible. How many people are estimated were poisoned? I mean, I know it was hard to determine what were true or who, what was not true about certain particular people.
There were over 400 people that Nick arrested, of which 200, just about 200, were tried in a secret tribunal. Eventually, as things started getting closer and closer and closer to Louis XIV's court, the king got very nervous about information getting out, who was under suspicion and who was not. So over 200 people were tried. And then we do know that just under 35 people were executed, of which some were of the nobility. Wow. So we can say, I think, I would say with confidence, there were at least 40 or 50 poisonings. But of course, in the imagination of the time period, it was an epidemic. In fact, people writing letters saying, I don't know who to trust. Good thing I could trust my sons and my daughters, because who knows what they could be putting into my food. That's why they called it inheritance powders. That was a way you wanted to get rid of your parents so you could get their money. You just sort of administer an inheritance powder.
And Regnier, he had certain powers he was allowed to do, and some of them were pretty gruesome when it came to interrogation. So, and so what were some of those? And these weren't things that normally anyone had really used these types of things before in this way, or was it, I don't know if Louis had given him certain permission to do certain things.
Well, how it worked in French law at the time, a person had to be convicted of the crime first. So we often think about torture during the Inquisition as a way to get incriminating information out of a suspect to be able then
Sure.
to
Right.
put them up for trial. In France, what would happen is you'd be put on trial, and then you would have an opportunity to be tortured as a
geez,
way
okay.
for the police chief to get more information from you, and they would take you right to the brink of death. In fact, they would have doctors in attendance to make sure that the torturers didn't go too far, because what they wanted to do is to make sure that you were fully alive to experience your execution the following day. It's really quite horrible.
jeez.
And La Reynie did have those powers. He was offered those powers by the king. And so that goes to the ethical dimension. How
Right.
far is he willing
Sure.
to go?
Right.
And so he surprises me.
Yeah.
I didn't think when I first started researching
That
this
he
that
would
he
do
would
that.
do, not my Nick.
So you're professor of French
Mm-hmm.
and biomedical ethics and society at Vanderbilt. So
I bet you there are a lot of people like that in the United States.
yeah, no. But combining the 2, I
Mm-hmm.
know some of you teach them separately, but you combine them both in this book so beautifully. You know,
Oh.
well, you think about, because there's so much ethics in this
Mm,
book, you
mm-hmm.
know, but also too about just the of medical treatment and the
Mm-hmm.
way things were viewed and how things were compounded to make certain potions and poisons and that sort of thing. So what do you teach your students at Vanderbilt when you talk about medical ethics and society?
Well, I teach early history of medicine,
Okay.
from in my survey classes to pre-med students, from antiquity like Hippocrates and Galen
sure.
up until the Enlightenment and one of the 18th century. And so one of the things that I always tell students is what does medical practice mean when we're a couple of centuries away from anesthesia, we're a couple centuries away from anesthetics, and how for me, what I'm most interested in is how new practices involving medicine are received in a community, right? And that's where
right.
the blood transfusion
Sure,
book came from.
yeah, right.
And then also too, what do people do? For this book, it's more of the ethics of you're a medical doctor and you are called to witness a torture. What does that mean? And in what ways is medicine complicit or resistant to medical ethics abuses, right? So
sure.
I sort of teach medical ethics before the whole idea of
Yeah,
medical
yeah,
ethics was
right.
even on the
Yeah.
radar for these people.
I read that you split your time between Nashville, where Vanderbilt
Mm-hmm.
is, and then Provence, right?
Yeah, it sort of stinks, doesn't it?
I know, it's horrible. I am just so jealous. So how much time do you spend at each? Obviously, it's the school year. You're here, right? But then,
I'm there most of the summer, each
Wow,
summer.
beautiful.
And then
Yeah.
over breaks, and then any time I can get there.
Wow.
And so, with the long story short is I'm the granddaughter of French immigrants, and they were from the south of France. And there is something, I think, genetic in me where I can't be out of, I know this sounds, difficult, hard life, but I really have a hard time being out of France for more than about 3 months because I just sort of feel this call. And we've been, fortunate because of, the French family connection is we have a family home there. So it's nice. So it's I bring a small suitcase, and the minute I get there I feel home, and there's a warm meal waiting for me, and it's where I do, I think, some of my best writing because I can wander those streets and feel what it might have been like to be there, and also speak the language, which
yeah.
helps.
So did you grow up speaking French then?
With my grandmother.
Oh, how wonderful! Yeah, that is so incredible.
Oh, she was my soulmate.
Yeah. So what are you working on now? I know this took probably how many years to gather all the
5
research?
years,
5
yeah,
years.
yeah.
So but any ideas on what you might be working on?
Yeah, and that's what I'm sniffing out my stories right now. I know that for nonfiction, I'm ready to move into newer periods. So I'm working on something right now that will be set in 19th century Paris. Again, true crime, because wherever there's Paris in my mind, there's crime. But I'm really struggling with not wanting to leave the 17th century because there's still a lot of stories to
I
be
bet.
told. So that might take a different type of form, but I will always be in the archives.
Okay. But Holly, thanks so much for sitting down with me. It was so much fun.
Oh, I love this.
And congratulations on City of Light, City of Poison.
Thank you so much.
What a great conversation with Holly Tucker. Her parents live here in Naperville, so Naperville is kind of her hometown now. She's a professor at Vanderbilt University, and her new nonfiction book is called City of Light, City of Poison, Murder and Magic, and the First Police Chief of Paris. You absolutely have to read this one. You won't believe the story about Louis XIV. Thanks for joining me on Authors Revealed.